So where do we have some wire. All right, so the strategy that we're going to have is each one of our buttons, we're going to need to solder a wire to it that will eventually make its way over to the Raspberry Pi. And so on these guys here, there's a couple of different ways that we can attach them. So there's these two contact points on the front of the controller that you actually interface with. So one of them's at ground and one of them's live. On the back, there's a bunch of contacts as well. So these are, like you can see, PC8, PC9, PC3, PC, and then PB2, PB1, and whatnot all around the board. So on the back of the controller, basically these contact pads connect to the live side of the terminals on the front. So basically what we're going to need to do is we need to connect to the live side, connect the live side of each one of these buttons to the Raspberry Pi. And then what the Raspberry Pi will do is it will serve as a ground for those wires. So when we tell the Raspberry Pi will complete the circuit and will activate the button. So we can either connect it to the front or we can connect it to the back. So oftentimes I like to connect it to the back because you can it's a little bit easier to solder to these points because they're nice and separate. Whereas if you connect to the front, basically the positive and the negative are very, very close together. So if you're soldering and not being careful, you can end up connecting the two terminals with solder. So if we have this one here on the finished product. So this one has sort of both of the versions of the connections. So on these things, there's a couple of them that are connected to the front terminals. So on this case, the live side is on the left. And so you can see the lead coming off of the terminal has been soldered to the live side. But in doing so, you end up getting solder on both sides. And so oftentimes you can connect those two easily with solder by accident. And so I think in this case right here, you'll see this terminal right here, or this button, is kind of a little bit damaged. And so originally this button had a wire or lead soldered to the front of it, and it ended up getting too much solder, and so it connected everything. So when we went to desolder it, basically it ended up destroying the actual contacts here, which is often a problem because these PCBs are quite delicate. So if you are too aggressive with your 800-degree soldering iron, you can end up burning off these conductive pads on it. So if you destroy one of the buttons, luckily though, we have those contacts in the back. So that back button, or that button that was damaged, has been reconnected on the back. And so that one, we have a pretty good solder connection there. Not bad. The actual PCB is a little bit discolored there. That's just some of the, I think it's like the insulating shellac or whatever that when you solder it, it will discolor a little bit. It's not really that big of an issue. If you wanted to, you could clean it off with some rubbing alcohol or whatever, but it's not really doing any problems here. All right. So then the next part of the controllers is once we have them wired up, we can then connect those wires to a piece of perf board. So the perf board will bring the wires in, feed it through one of the holes. So in this case, this piece of perf board is not really ideal because this is one that doesn't have any soldering pads on it. This is just a completely like naked piece of perf board. A more useful one is like one of these that has solder pads. In particular, they're through-hole solder pads. So they have metal on this side that go through the entire hole and then connect to the other side. These are much better because when you put the wire through it, so if I have this little one here, you put the wire through it. Yeah, there we go. Then we actually have something that will, when we solder, will actually connect the wire to the actual board physically with the solder. Whereas with this one, it's not, you can't really do that. So the board here is a little bit messy because what has to happen is that these resistors, which are then getting soldered in series with the leads, basically the terminals of the resistor is getting soldered directly to the wire itself, so that these things sometimes can be a little bit loose because they're not physically connected to the actual perf board. But so we're going to solder the leads to one of the terminals on the resistor. Then the resistor other terminal gets fed through about 4 spaces on the perf board away. The other terminal then gets connected to one of the pins on the female header. And so then that basically completes the actual soldering that you need to perform. The only thing that you have to be careful of is making sure that you are connecting each one of the buttons to a proper GPIO pin for the Raspberry Pi, because you'll notice that these ones we have a total of 20 pins, but not all of the pins can actually be programmed. So some of them are ground pins on the Raspberry Pi. So here, like this one is a live pin at, I think it's a plus 3.3 volt power pin. But then the next 3 are programmable, then we have a ground, then another 3 programmable, and then another ground, another 3 that are programmable. So you just have to make sure that when you're putting everything together that you're actually connecting buttons to programmable pins on the Raspberry Pi. So you'll notice that we have that same pattern. We have unconnected one, then we have 3 programmable ones, then we have an unconnected one, 3 connected pins not connected, then another 3 that are connected to, in this case, those are connected to the directional pad terminals. Then we have this one here. This one's a ground wire, so this pin here is a ground pin for the GPIO on the Raspberry Pi. We have that soldered to the ground on the actual board. That way the Raspberry Pi and the Xbox controller have a common ground that allows you to have very smoother operation when you're using the Raspberry Pi to program or to activate these buttons. And then this last one here, we skip another one, and then we have one more programmable pin. That one is connected to, on this side, to one of the triggers. So that one basically allows you to depress the right trigger. So you'll see, there we go. So on these controllers here, like I said before, the left side is the live side, and the back and the other side is ground. But I think some of these it's reversed. No, that one's good. That one's the same. Yeah. So this is the one that goes to the Xbox button. So like that one is, in fact, reversed in its polarity. That's right. I just said reverse the polarity. Whereas again, this one over here has the same orientation as the A, B, and X, Y buttons. On the back side, you can do the same thing. Typically there is, it usually changes, but there's a labeled GND for ground. So you can use that as a common ground and then connect, touching to various points. So like this one is one of the buttons on the front, and it is live.